ransom letter demanding $118,000 was left behind on the stairs by the kitchen.
JonBenét Ramsey's murder remains one of America's most haunting mysteries. For nearly 3 decades, speculation and theories replaced answers. Now, her father, John Ramsay, steps forward with a revelation that may change everything.
JonBenét's family now hoping that, plus renewed public interest and new DNA technology, might finally help close this case.
His words, after years of silence, could provide the breakthrough investigators and the public have long sought, offering new hope in solving this tragic, decades-old case. Before the tragedy that shook America, JonBenét Ramsey was known as a successful businessman and a family man who had worked his way up the corporate ladder. Born in 1943 in Lincoln, Nebraska, John grew up with a keen sense of discipline and ambition. After studying electrical engineering and business, he entered the tech world at a time when computers were just beginning to reshape industries. His career flourished, and by the mid-1990s, he had founded Access Graphics, a computer services company that would eventually be valued at over $1 billion. Those who knew him described John as intelligent and focused, but also private. He wasn't a man who sought attention or the spotlight. At home, though, he was very different. Friends and neighbors saw him as a dedicated father who adored his children and worked hard to give them the best. He and his wife Patsy, a former beauty queen herself, raised their family in Boulder, Colorado, where they were deeply involved in their community. But one can't talk about John Ramsey without mentioning his daughter, JonBenét. JonBenét Patricia Ramsey was born in 1990. From the very beginning, she was the shining light of the family. A little girl with big, curious eyes, golden hair, and a dazzling smile. She seemed destined to stand out. With her mother's guidance, she entered child beauty pageants, where she quickly made a name for herself. With the crowns, sashes, and trophies, JonBenét was a rising star in the pageant world, known not only for her looks, but for her charisma and charm on stage. To many in Boulder, the Ramseys looked like the picture-perfect American family. John was the accomplished provider, Patsy the elegant mother, and JonBenét the adored little girl whose presence lit up every room. She was often described as a child full of life. She was playful, creative, and affectionate, with a natural ability to capture hearts wherever she went. But just as JonBenét was stepping into the world with bright promise, no one ever imagined the darker fate that awaited them. Something that was capable of turning their family's name into one of the most infamous in true crime history. And for decades, this crime remained unsolved, constantly overshadowed by rumors, suspicion, and unanswered questions. Yet today, John Ramsey claims he holds the one thing the world has been waiting for. And that is where the story takes its sharpest and most haunting turn: the push for justice. When people hear the name John Ramsey, they often think of a grieving father trapped in one of America's most enduring mysteries. But in recent years, John has tried to change that picture. He doesn't only want to be remembered as the man who lost his daughter under tragic circumstances. He wants to be known as the man who refused to give up, one who insisted that modern science could still bring justice, even decades later. For years, John has argued that technology has advanced far beyond what investigators used in the late 1990s and early 2000s. He pointed to forensic genetic genealogy, the very same tool that unmasked the Golden State Killer after more than 40 years. If it worked for one of the most notorious unsolved serial cases in American history, why couldn't it work for the JonBenét case? John insisted that there is DNA evidence from the crime scene found on JonBenét's clothing that was never properly explored with today's tools. He believed this evidence held the key, and he's been vocal about it. But here's where the clash begins. The Boulder Police Department has not shared John's enthusiasm. Their stance has been cautious, if not outright resistant. Investigators have argued that the DNA evidence may not be as reliable as John believes. According to them, it could be a mixture of profiles, possibly touched or contaminated over the years. Some even suggested that the trace DNA might belong to someone who had no connection to the crime at all. Perhaps a factory worker, or someone who handled the clothing before it ever reached the Ramsay household. That explanation, however, didn't sit well with John. To him, dismissing the DNA was just another way of closing the door on progress. He felt the reluctance wasn't based on science, but on a lack of willpower, or worse, a desire to avoid admitting past mistakes. And so, he has made it his mission to push, to argue, and to demand that the evidence be tested with the very best methods available today. John has also pointed to examples that are hard to ignore. In California, investigators used genealogical DNA databases to track down Joseph DeAngelo, better known as the Golden State Killer, after decades of dead ends. In New York, advances in DNA technology also played a role in cracking the Gilgo Beach murders. To John, these cases prove his point. The tools are there, the breakthroughs are possible, and the only thing missing is the determination to apply them. He has said repeatedly that if investigators are willing to embrace this technology, the case can finally move forward. Over the years, John has met with law enforcement officials in hopes of persuading them. Some meetings have been disappointing, with officials holding the same line about contamination and uncertainty. For John, those moments are a reminder of how far he still has to go. But there have also been signs of hope. Recently, he had a 90-minute meeting with Boulder police leadership, and for the first time in a long while, he left feeling encouraged and hopeful. That optimism came from the new leadership within the department, which appears more open to exploring advanced DNA methods. The head of the department signaled a willingness to at least consider forensic genealogy, a shift from the rigid refusal of earlier years. For John, that meeting was more than just talk. It was a sign that the walls might finally be cracking. He believes that with the right pressure, the department could allow independent experts to re-examine the DNA and push the case into new territory. John hasn't limited his efforts to closed-door meetings. He has also become an advocate for legislative reform. In Colorado, he has pushed for laws that would allow families of homicide victims to demand independent reviews of cold cases. He points to the Homicide Victims' Families' Rights Act as a model, saying that families deserve a legal pathway to seek progress when local police departments stall. To him, this isn't just about one case anymore. It's about changing the way unsolved murders are handled across the board. He argues that families should not have to wait decades while evidence sits unused in storage. Instead, they should be able to push for outside experts, new tests, and modern approaches whenever a case remains cold. John has also worked to rally support beyond the legal and police circles. He has spoken at events, given interviews, and made his case to lawmakers. He has reminded them that DNA technology doesn't just serve science. It should equally serve justice. His persistence has gained attention, and slowly, more voices have joined his call for action. But as John would soon find, not everyone shared in his enthusiasm and raised hopes. Some officials argue that constantly revisiting the case drains resources from current investigations. Others worry about setting a precedent where families could demand reinvestigations at any time. But John counters that justice should never expire. If technology exists that can help solve a crime, then refusing to use it is unacceptable. As of now, there is a sense of cautious optimism. Under fresh leadership, Colorado authorities have said publicly that 2025 could be the year this case sees a breakthrough. They are looking at updated DNA tools, renewed investigative strategies, and yes, forensic genealogy. It's not a promise of resolution. It's not confirmation of John's bold declaration that he has proof. But it is movement, and for John, that movement matters. After decades of frustration, even a hint of progress feels like a victory. But let's take a step back to the unfortunate event that resulted in this movement: the heartbreaking murder. It was the morning after Christmas, December 26, 1996, when panic ripped through the Ramsey home in Boulder, Colorado. The Ramseys were supposed to be preparing for a family trip. They had spent Christmas Day together, exchanging gifts and enjoying the warmth of the holiday season. John Ramsey, a successful businessman, had built a comfortable life for his wife, Patsy, and their children, 9-year-old Burke and 6-year-old JonBenét. Their home was large, decorated for the holidays, and filled with the excitement that followed a Christmas morning. But that excitement turned into horror before dawn. Patsy Ramsey was the first to discover that something was terribly wrong. Around 5:30 a.m., she walked downstairs and noticed a 3-page note sitting on the staircase. At first glance, it looked like a ransom note. The letter demanded $118,000 for JonBenét's safe return, a strangely specific number, which investigators later learned was almost identical to the amount of John's recent Christmas bonus. The note instructed the Ramseys not to call the police, but panic overtook Patsy. Instead of staying quiet, she ran to the phone and dialed 911. Her voice, recorded on that call, trembled as she told the dispatcher her daughter had been kidnapped. Within minutes, police arrived. Neighbors, friends, and even a family minister came to the house to comfort the Ramseys. The home quickly filled with people. It was the worst possible scenario for an investigation. The crime scene was contaminated before evidence could be secured. But before that morning, the family had planned to fly to Michigan to visit John's older children from his first marriage. Their bags were already packed. According to John and Patsy, the night before had ended peacefully. They had tucked JonBenét into bed after a busy Christmas day. Burke was also asleep. Then, in the early hours of the morning, Patsy stumbled onto the note that turned their world upside down. They believed JonBenét had been kidnapped while they slept. The suitcase waiting by the door for their trip only added to the confusion. Nothing seemed stolen, and there were no clear signs of forced entry. Yet JonBenét was missing. Hours passed as police searched the house. Officers initially focused on the ransom note, treating it as the central clue. Investigators expected the kidnapper to make contact, perhaps to arrange the money drop. But no call ever came. Then, at around 1 p.m., John Ramsey made a discovery that remains one of the most chilling in true crime history. Ignoring orders to leave the search to police, John went to the basement. There, behind a door in a little-used storage room, he found his daughter. JonBenét was lying on the floor. A white blanket partially covered her body. There was a garrote tied tightly around her neck, fashioned from a piece of cord and a broken paintbrush. There were also signs of blunt force trauma to her head. John screamed, carried his daughter upstairs, and placed her body near the Christmas tree. In that instant, any remaining chance of preserving the crime scene was lost. From the start, investigators faced an uphill battle. The house had been filled with people for hours. Evidence was disturbed. The ransom note, which should have been handled with gloves and preserved immediately, had been touched by Patsy. Friends and neighbors had walked through rooms that may have held critical clues. The ransom note itself became one of the most hotly debated pieces of evidence in the entire case. It was unusually long for a real ransom note. The note was more than 2 pages long. It was written on paper from Ramsey's own home using one of Patsy's pens. The language was strange, even theatrical. Investigators believed it had been staged to mislead them. Because of the note, Suspicion almost immediately turned inward. Could the Ramsays themselves have staged the kidnapping to cover up what really happened? Police and media quickly zeroed in on John, Patsy, and even young Burke. Patsy, in particular, came under scrutiny. Some speculated she may have lashed out at JonBenét in a moment of anger, then staged the note to hide the truth. Others accused John of being the mastermind behind a cover-up. Even Burke, only 9 years old at the time, was considered a suspect. Rumors spread that he may have hurt his sister during a childish quarrel, and that the parents had covered for him. Though there was no evidence for this, the story lingered in the tabloids. The Ramsays denied all allegations. They insisted they were innocent and wanted nothing more than to find the person responsible. But in the court of public opinion, they were already convicted. Television shows, newspapers, and magazines painted them as cold, calculating, and evasive. By 1999, a grand jury was convened to consider the evidence. In secret, jurors actually voted to indict John and Patsy Ramsey on charges of child abuse, resulting in death. But Boulder's district attorney at the time, Alex Hunter, refused to sign the indictment. He claimed there was not enough evidence to go to trial. For the Ramsays, it was a partial reprieve, but not vindication. The suspicions lingered. Everywhere they went, people looked at them not as victims, but as suspects. As years passed, no new arrests were made. The case stalled, but the public fascination never died. Then, in 2006, tragedy struck the family once more. Patsy Ramsey, who had been battling ovarian cancer for years, passed away at the age of 49. She went to her grave without clearing her name in the eyes of many. For John Ramsay, it was another devastating loss. Now widowed, he remained the only parent left to protect his children's reputations. That same year, something happened that shifted the case dramatically. Forensic science had advanced since the 1990s, and investigators decided to retest some of the evidence. What they found was astonishing. On JonBenét's clothing, they discovered unidentified male DNA. This DNA did not belong to John, Patsy, or Burke. It did not match any close relatives. It was, in effect, the silent witness that pointed away from the Ramsay family and toward an unknown intruder. In 2008, the Boulder District Attorney formally cleared the Ramsays, declaring that the DNA evidence exonerated them. It was a bittersweet victory. For more than a decade, John and his late wife had lived under suspicion. Finally, science had given them relief. But the real killer was still out there. For John, the DNA became more than just a piece of evidence. It became an obsession, a mission, and a lifeline to the truth. He believed it proved what he had been saying from the very beginning, that an outsider had broken into their home and committed the unthinkable. Until date, John held on to the hope that one day, technology would catch up. He believed the DNA was the key, and he refused to let it fade into the background. Seeing how this has become an infamous true crime story, what does the public have to say to all of these? Let's find out. The public's voice. From the very first hours of December 26, 1996, when the shocking news broke that 6-year-old JonBenét Ramsey had been found dead inside her family's home, the public was hooked. Television screens filled with the story. Newspapers ran headlines for weeks, and millions of people across America formed opinions almost instantly. What made the case different from so many other crimes was not only the age of the victim, but the sheer strangeness of the circumstances. A wealthy family in a quiet neighborhood. A ransom note written on the family's own notepad. A child's body was discovered not in some distant location, but in the basement of the house itself. People debated it, obsessed over it, and in many ways judged the family before police even had their footing. In the late 1990s, the mood was brutal. Many in the public turned their suspicion squarely on the Ramsays. The ransom note was at the center of this skepticism. People asked, who writes a 3-page note in the middle of a kidnapping? Why demand such a strange amount of money, $118,000, when John Ramsay was a multimillionaire? And why use a pen and paper from inside the house? To ordinary Americans watching from afar, it didn't add up. Interviews followed the incident. John and Patsy Ramsey appeared on television not long after the murder, pleading for help. But instead of grief, their demeanor struck many as odd. Some thought they seemed rehearsed. Others felt Patsy's tone was defensive. In living rooms across the country, viewers asked the same questions. Were these grieving parents, or were they hiding something? The tabloids added fuel. Magazines ran headlines accusing the parents outright. Talk shows invited experts to speculate about the case. The Ramsays' 9-year-old son, Burke, was even dragged into the storm, with theories spreading that he may have lashed out at his sister in anger, and the parents had staged a cover-up. For many Americans, JonBenét's death became less about a child and more about the spectacle of suspicion. As months turned into years, the case never went away. Whenever new headlines appeared, public debate reignited. Neighbors talked about the family, strangers pointed fingers. In many ways, the Ramsays were tried in the court of public opinion long before a jury ever heard evidence. By 1999, when a grand jury actually voted to indict John and Patsy on charges of child abuse resulting in death, the public felt validated. Even though the district attorney declined to prosecute, many people took the mere existence of the indictment as proof that something dark had happened inside that house. The Ramsays, of course, denied everything. But in the eyes of millions, the stain was permanent. But did they entirely lack sympathizers? It would be unfair to say the entire public condemned the Ramsays. Over time, especially as they gave more interviews and shared their pain, some people began to sympathize. They saw a grieving mother and father crushed by loss, and they asked what kind of society jumps to attack the victims? This division became sharper after 2006, when Patsy Ramsey died of cancer. For those who had long believed in her innocence, her death was a tragic injustice. To them, Patsy was an unfortunate woman who went to her grave under a cloud of suspicion she didn't deserve. For skeptics, however, it didn't change much. Some argued she escaped justice, others softened, saying no matter the truth, she had suffered enough. The public conversation became a clash of two camps between those who believed the Ramsays were wrongly accused and those who believed they had gotten away with something. In 2008, DNA tests cleared the Ramsay family when investigators found an unknown man's DNA on JonBenét's clothes. For many in the public, this was a moment of whiplash. The very people they had condemned for more than a decade were suddenly cleared. Newspaper editorials questioned whether the media had gone too far in vilifying the family. Television hosts wondered if the country owed John Ramsay an apology. But not everyone was convinced. Some argued the DNA could have been contaminated from a factory worker who handled the clothing before it was even purchased. Others said the Ramsays still looked suspicious, DNA or not. Online forums exploded with debate as amateur sleuths dissected every detail, convinced they could solve the mystery from their keyboards. As the year 2010 unfolded, the internet amplified public obsession. Online communities, true crime podcasts, and YouTube channels picked apart the case. Some focused on the ransom note, analyzing handwriting and word choice. Others zeroed in on Burke, speculating endlessly about what he knew. For John Ramsay, this digital storm was a double-edged sword. On one hand, it kept the case alive. On the other hand, it meant his family remained trapped in a cycle of judgment. Still, as DNA technology advanced, more people began to see his point. If science had moved forward, why not use it to finally bring clarity? In recent years, John has reinvented himself as an advocate, not just for his daughter's case, but for the use of modern DNA technology in solving cold cases. And once again, the public has reacted. Some have praised him. They see a father who refuses to give up, who has endured unimaginable loss and decades of suspicion, yet still pushes for truth. These voices admire his determination, especially when he cites successes like the capture of the Golden State Killer. Others remain skeptical. They argue he is clinging to hope, that the DNA evidence may not be as clear as he believes. Some critics say his public statements overstate what science can actually deliver. They worry that his bold claims may raise false expectations. Still, John's persistence has struck something rare. When he lobbies lawmakers for reforms that would allow families to demand independent reviews of cold cases, many members of the public nod in agreement. They point out that if technology exists to solve crimes, withholding it is a disservice to justice. Nearly 3 decades later, and still, on social media, you will find comments ranging from deep sympathy to harsh doubt. Some call John a hero father. Others still suspect him, refusing to accept the DNA evidence as definitive. What unites most voices, however, is frustration. People want closure. They want answers. They want someone, anyone, held accountable for JonBenét's death. When news broke that Boulder police had met with John in 2025 to discuss modern DNA methods, many reacted with cautious optimism. Could this finally be the year? Some expressed hope that forensic genealogy would bring the breakthrough. Others rolled their eyes, saying they had heard promises before. But whether supportive or skeptical, the public has never stopped talking. For nearly 30 years, JonBenét's name has never left the headlines, and John Ramsay's fight has ensured it won't. The enduring public interest comes down to more than just the crime itself. It's the combination of tragedy, wealth, media spectacle, and mystery. It's the way suspicion turned inward on a family, tearing apart public trust. It's the promise of science offering answers, yet never quite delivering closure. In many ways, JonBenét's case has become a mirror for society. It shows how quickly people can judge, how easily narratives can be shaped, and how difficult it is to undo suspicion once it takes root. It also shows how technology changes expectations. People want DNA to provide certainty, even when reality is more complicated. What is clear is that the public has shaped this case as much as investigators have. From the suspicion that nearly destroyed the Ramsays to the cautious hope surrounding modern DNA, the public has always been the loudest detective of all. And as John Ramsay continues to push, the world is still watching, still debating, and still waiting for the day when the mystery of JonBenét Ramsey is finally resolved. But speaking of John, what has life been like for him, especially after losing wife and daughter? Life after tragedy. Nearly 3 decades have passed since the tragedy in Boulder that captured headlines around the world. While the crime itself remains unsolved, the surviving members of the Ramsay family have had to find a way to live on. For John Ramsay, after losing his daughter and, later in 2006, his wife Patsy to cancer, John slowly rebuilt his personal life. In 2011, he remarried. His wife, Jean Rousseau, is a fashion designer who once worked on uniforms for celebrities and restaurants. The couple now live in Moab, Utah, where John enjoys a quieter rhythm of family life, with children and grandchildren from their blended family. At events like CrimeCon, John continues to share his message. He has described the lasting damage of public suspicion, explaining that once the media labels you as guilty, your reputation never goes back to pure white. Yet his fight now isn't about his name. It's about making sure the truth comes out. Burke Ramsay, on the other hand, now in his late 30s, has chosen the opposite path. While his father remains in the public eye, Burke lives quietly in Michigan, far from the cameras. He works in technology, taking a role in software and IT management, and keeps his personal circle small. He is reportedly in a steady relationship, but he avoids public attention at all costs. It's not hard to understand why. From the moment the case broke, tabloids splashed Burke's face across their covers, speculating about his involvement despite his age. He was only 9 at the time. In 2016, Burke broke his silence in a rare interview on Dr. Phil. He recalled how overwhelming it was to grow up under suspicion, even as a child. For a long time, the media basically made our lives crazy. He spoke about the lasting memories of his sister's funeral and the strange, surreal spotlight that turned his childhood into a spectacle. Since then, Burke has stepped away from interviews. He even declined to participate in the 2024 Netflix series about the case, signaling that he no longer wants to be part of the public conversation. For him, a normal life means keeping to himself, working, and staying far from the circus that once surrounded his family. Currently, John Ramsay lives as a fighter, constantly pressing police and lawmakers to do more, while Burke Ramsay lives as a survivor, building a quiet life in Michigan with little public contact. But it might be safe to say that the two hold on to one belief, that one day the truth would come out and the criminal responsible for the loss of JonBenét would be brought to book. And at last, the justice the world is looking for would one day prevail. What do you think about John Ramsay's shocking claim? Could DNA finally crack the case that has haunted America for nearly 3 decades? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more stories. We'll see you in the next video.